The sun had dipped below the jagged horizon of the frontier, leaving the sky painted in a furious cascade of crimson and amber, the kind that made even the most hardened settlers pause in awe. The wind whispered through the tall prairie grasses, carrying with it the scent of dry earth, distant pine, and something indefinably wild, something that belonged neither to the settlers' dusty cabins nor to the cattle they tended. Evelyn stood at the edge of the cliff overlooking the canyon, her long skirts rustling softly, brushing against the weathered rocks as if the land itself were trying to hold her in its embrace. She had grown up in these unforgiving lands where survival was a matter of instinct and courage. Yet tonight, a strange unease twisted her chest, a sensation she could not name but knew intimately. Her heart pounded with a rhythm that defied reason, echoing in the hollows of her ribcage like a drum calling her toward something both forbidden and irresistible. Across the canyon, the shadows of the dense forest gathered like ink spilling into the night, hiding the secrets of those who dared tread their paths. Evelyn had heard the stories all her life, tales of Apache warriors who moved like ghosts, who could disappear into the brush only to reappear with lethal precision. Her father, a grizzled rancher with hands as rough as leather and a temper as sharp as barbed wire, had warned her repeatedly to never venture near the canyon's edge after sunset. But tonight she felt drawn there, compelled by a force she could neither understand nor resist. She did not know that in the darkness a pair of keen eyes watched her from the shelter of the trees, eyes that had traced her movements from afar, memorizing the graceful curve of her neck, the sway of her hair in the evening breeze, the subtle tension in her shoulders that betrayed both fear and defiance. He was an Apache warrior, tall and lean with the lithe strength of one accustomed to living off the land. And yet there was a gentleness in his gaze that contrasted sharply with the fierce reputation his people carried among the settlers. Every muscle in his body was coiled with readiness, a predator poised for action, yet tonight he felt no desire to strike. Instead, he felt a pull toward this woman who moved with the elegance of the wind itself, a pull that unsettled him in ways he had never known. Evelyn shivered, not from the coolness of the night, but from the inexplicable sense that she was not alone, that something, or someone, watched her with an intensity that bordered on reverence. She turned abruptly, her instincts screaming at her to flee, and for a fleeting moment their eyes met across the shadowed expanse. Time seemed to slow, the canyon falling into silence as if holding its breath, acknowledging the significance of that instant. His face was partially hidden in the shadows, yet she could see the sharp lines of his jaw, the dark penetrating depth of his eyes, and a small, almost imperceptible curve of a smile that made her pulse quicken. Fear and curiosity collided within her, a tumultuous storm she could not quell, leaving her trembling where she stood. The wind shifted, carrying with it a whisper that seemed to come from the warrior himself, though no words passed his lips. She felt it, an almost tangible pull, drawing her closer to the precipice, closer to the danger she had been warned about, closer to the forbidden possibility of connection. The canyon below seemed bottomless, a mirror of the chasm opening in her heart, a space she had long tried to fill with practicality, duty, and the predictable rhythms of frontier life. Yet tonight it yawned wide and bare, ready to swallow her whole. She had always imagined the wilderness as something to be conquered, something to be tamed with grit and determination. Yet in his presence, she realized how little she truly understood it, or herself. Her chest tightened as she recalled her mother's soft warnings, her sister's frightened whispers about the danger of crossing paths with those who lived outside the settlers' boundaries. But these words felt hollow against the reality of her present heartbeat, so rapid and erratic it seemed to echo through the canyon itself. He stepped forward then, his movement so fluid, so silent, that it was almost as if the earth itself had shifted to conceal his approach. Each step was measured, deliberate, carrying the weight of someone who knew the land intimately, who understood every crack in the rock, every whispering gust of wind, every snapping twig as if it were a word spoken directly to him. When he finally emerged from the shadows, the faint light of the dying sun touched the side of his face, revealing its sculpted symmetry, the subtle shadow of high cheekbones, the proud tilt of his chin, and the raw, untamed beauty of his presence. Evelyn's breath caught in her throat, her mind simultaneously screaming danger while her heart betrayed her. Whispering the truth she had tried to deny, she was captivated, ensnared and utterly undone by a man she was not meant to love, a man who should have been nothing more than a distant specter in the stories told by the fireside. Yet here he stood, real and undeniable, a living embodiment of the wild frontier she thought she knew, and in that moment, the world shifted. The familiar landscape of her life falling away to reveal the raw, uncharted territory of the heart, a place where love, fear, desire, and danger coalesced into a single, overwhelming truth. Evelyn could feel the electricity of his presence before he spoke, a silent intensity that pressed against her senses, making the hairs on the back of her neck rise and sending a shiver down her spine. That was equal parts fear and anticipation. The wind that had whispered through the canyon earlier now carried a charged stillness, as if the very world had stilled to witness what was about to unfold. Her fingers clenched at the folds of her skirt, nails biting into the fabric, grounding her in the precarious edge of the cliff, yet unable to quell the quickening of her heartbeat that had grown frantic, almost painful in its rapid rhythm. His eyes, dark and fathomless, held her as though he could see past the carefully constructed walls of propriety and expectation she had spent her entire life erecting. Every glance seemed to strip away another layer of her composure, leaving her raw and exposed, though not in shame, but in a kind of trembling awe she had never experienced before. The canyon below, the forest surrounding her, the distant cries of coyotes and the whispering of the wind, all became background music to the singular, impossible magnetism between them. He did not speak, at least not immediately, for words would have been crude instruments to convey the depth of what his gaze already communicated. There was an understanding that needed no articulation, a silent dialogue that coursed between them, an acknowledgement that both terrified and thrilled them in equal measure. Evelyn felt her breath hitch as she sensed the quiet patience in him, the unwavering calm beneath the storm of raw energy that radiated from his very being. It was a patience born of centuries-old survival, of knowledge that life on the frontier was measured not in moments, but in an eternity of careful observation and precise action. Yet even with all his experience and restraint, the tension in his body suggested a restraint, a hunger for connection that had long been denied, a longing that had been carefully tempered against a world that would never condone what they both felt. She realized with a painful clarity that she had been drawn to him long before this instant, that the fluttering of her heart when she had glimpsed him in the distance, the inexplicable restlessness in her soul during the long, lonely days of frontier labor, all pointed to this forbidden attraction, and yet fear remained, a gnawing primal awareness that crossing the invisible line between them would unleash consequences neither could fully predict. Her father, her community, the whispers and judgment of the townsfolk, all were specters looming over the precipice of desire, reminding her that this was a love they would never understand, never accept. Still, the pull between them was undeniable. She felt it in the press of the evening air against her skin, in the way the earth seemed to shift subtly beneath her feet, as though even the land itself recognized the gravity of their encounter. He took a single step closer, his motion slow, deliberate, careful not to startle her, and yet it carried with it the unspoken weight of inevitability. Evelyn's breath hitched and she found herself unable to retreat, rooted in place by a combination of fear, fascination, and something far more dangerous, longing. The stories she had been told about Apache warriors, stories of violence, cunning, and mercilessness, blurred and faded under the weight of his presence, revealing a different truth, one she had never expected. He was fierce, yes, untamed and wild, but there was also a gentleness there, a careful attentiveness that seemed attuned not only to her physical form, but to the rhythm of her thoughts, the hidden crevices of her mind, the tender vulnerabilities she had never dared to reveal to anyone. He extended his hand slightly, a simple gesture yet laden with meaning, as though offering a bridge between their worlds, a fragile lifeline across the chasm of fear and societal expectation. Her fingers trembled as she considered the impossibility of touching him, of letting herself be seen, yet the ache in her chest demanded surrender, demanded that she acknowledge the undeniable truth stirring within her. She could not resist him. The wind picked up again, sweeping through the canyon with a low, mournful whistle, carrying with it the scent of sagebrush and pine, of distant fires and untamed lands, intertwining with the warmth emanating from his presence to form a heady, almost intoxicating mixture. She could feel the pulse of the earth beneath her feet, a steady, grounding rhythm that mirrored the rapid drumbeat of her own heart. Her mind raced a chaotic storm of warnings, fantasies, and aching desires, yet the part of her that had long been silenced by duty and caution, the part of her that yearned for connection, for the kind of intimacy that transcended societal rules and whispered truths into the soul, rose insistently to the surface. He did not break the silence with words, but let the quiet speak, let the tension build, let every subtle movement convey what language could not. His eyes never left hers, holding her captive in a gaze that was both fierce and tender. Dangerous and protective, wild and intimate, a combination that set her entire being alight with emotions she had no name for. She felt herself leaning slightly toward him, unconsciously drawn by a gravity beyond her control, and with that small, almost imperceptible motion, she surrendered to the inevitability that had been written in the stars, long before she had ever stepped foot on this frontier. And yet the awareness of the world around them, the harsh judgment, the danger, the impossibility of their union, lingered like a shadow at the edges of her mind, whispering that every moment they spent in each other's presence was a stolen fragment of time, fleeting and precious. Still she could not retreat. Still she could not deny the fire that now consumed her from within, the heat of a longing that demanded expression, the kind of love that could not be tamed even by fear, even by reason, even by the rigid rules of the world in which they lived. Every fiber of her being ached with the knowledge that what they felt was forbidden, that to act upon it would bring consequences both known and unknowable. Yet simultaneously, every fiber of her being pulsed with the intoxicating thrill of connection, of desire, of the exquisite agony of love that demanded risk and courage. And as he stepped closer, the world seemed to fall away, leaving only the two of them suspended in the fragile, trembling space between fear and longing, between danger and the undeniable magnetism that bound their hearts together against all reason, against all logic, against the cruel, unyielding realities of the frontier that had forged them both into the people they were. The canyon seemed to shrink around them, folding the vastness of the wilderness into a tight, almost sacred space where only the two of them existed, a world apart from the settlers' judgments, the strictures of society, and even the harsh laws of survival that governed life on the frontier. Evelyn felt the heat of his presence against the cool night air, a warmth that seeped into her bones, igniting a fire she had never allowed herself to feel. She wanted to flee, wanted to retreat to the safety of her father's ranch, to the rigid predictability of the life she had always known. Yet her body betrayed her intentions, leaning slightly toward him despite her mind's frantic protests. He reached out again, this time more boldly, his hand hovering near hers, the space between them charged with an almost unbearable tension. Every instinct screamed danger. Every thought cautioned restraint, yet a deeper, more primal instinct urged her to close the distance, to feel the weight of his hand against hers, to know what it might mean to surrender just a fraction of herself to him. When their fingers finally brushed, the touch was electric, sending a shockwave of sensation through her entire being, igniting every nerve ending with a fierce, uncontainable intensity. The simplest contact, the warmth of his skin against hers, was enough to shatter the walls she had built around her heart, to dissolve the careful composure that had protected her all her life. She gasped softly, startled by the power of such a small gesture, and he smiled. That same small, almost imperceptible curve of his lips that seemed to say everything words could never convey. The world around them, the canyon, the forest, the whispering wind faded into a blur, leaving only the immediacy of their connection, the raw, unspoken language of desire and longing that bound them in a tense, exquisite spell. He spoke then, his voice low and rough like gravel, yet carrying a melodic undertone that seemed to resonate within her chest, vibrating against the very core of her being. "You should not be here," he murmured, not as a warning but as a recognition of the impossible truth between them. She met his gaze, her own voice barely a whisper, trembling with both fear and defiance. "I can't pretend I love you." The words escaped her lips before she could stop them, raw and trembling, an admission she had kept buried beneath layers of duty, propriety, and fear of scandal. The canyon swallowed her confession, echoing it back in 1,000 whispering repetitions, each one reinforcing the gravity of what she had just revealed. For a heartbeat he was still, his expression unreadable in the fading light, and Evelyn's heart threatened to leap from her chest in anticipation and terror. Then he moved, closing the distance between them, his presence overwhelming yet tender, a paradox that left her both frightened and mesmerized. He lifted his hand, tracing the line of her jaw with careful reverence, his fingers grazing the skin as if it were the most fragile and precious thing in the world. Evelyn closed her eyes, leaning into the touch despite the warnings echoing in her mind. letting herself feel the undeniable reality of what was unfolding. The warmth of his hand, the heat radiating from his body, the slow, steady rhythm of his breathing. It all combined into a heady, intoxicating mixture that left her dizzy with longing. She wanted to pull back, to retreat into the safety of her carefully ordered life. But the pull of desire, the undeniable truth of their connection anchored her in place, forcing her to confront emotions she had long tried to suppress. His thumb brushed her cheek and she opened her eyes to meet his gaze, dark and fathomless, holding a tenderness and intensity that made her knees weak. She could see the conflict within him, the tension between his instincts to protect, to stay hidden, and the undeniable pull toward her, a force that defied reason and demanded acknowledgement. His other hand moved to gently cradle the back of her neck, guiding her closer, his fingers brushing against the nape of her hair, sending a shiver down her spine. The wind swirled around them, tugging at her skirts, teasing strands of hair across her face, but neither seemed to notice. The world had contracted to this single moment, this suspended instant in which every sensation was heightened, every heartbeat amplified, every breath a reminder of the dangerous intimacy they shared. She felt a flush rise to her cheeks, not from the chill of the night but from the intensity of his gaze, from the nearness of his body, from the awareness that he could be taken from her at any moment by circumstance, by prejudice, by the harsh realities of the frontier. Her hands trembled as they rested lightly against his chest, feeling the strength beneath the surface, the quiet power of a man who had survived 1,000 battles and yet stood before her now, in a vulnerability that mirrored her own. The canyon seemed to echo with unspoken words, the rocks and trees bearing silent witness to the impossible bond forming in that precarious space. Evelyn felt a tear slip down her cheek, not from sadness but from the overwhelming weight of love she had no right to claim, a love that defied the rules of her world and yet demanded acknowledgement. He leaned closer, his lips a whisper away from hers, and she could feel the heat of his breath mingling with hers, the faintest scent of pine and smoke, a primal grounding aroma that made her ache with longing. "You speak truth," he murmured, his lips brushing against her temple in a gentle, reverent gesture, though the world would never understand it. Her chest tightened at his words, the forbidden nature of their connection pressing down on her like the weight of the night sky itself. And yet in that moment, the fear mingled with exhilaration, creating a potent cocktail of emotions that left her trembling and breathless, teetering on the edge of surrender. She wanted to run, to flee from the consequences, but every fiber of her being was pulled toward him, toward the raw, unfiltered intensity of the love that had blossomed in the shadows of the frontier, in the spaces between fear and desire, between danger and the promise of something transcendent. His hands moved with slow, deliberate care, tracing the curves of her shoulders, the lines of her arms, each touch a wordless confession, a silent declaration of the depth of his feeling. She leaned into him, letting her head rest against his chest for a heartbeat, savoring the warmth, the steady pulse of life, the undeniable reality of the connection they shared. And in that precarious, breathless moment, she realized with a mix of terror and ecstasy that she could never deny him, could never pretend that the fire they had ignited was anything less than the truth of her heart. The canyon, the wind, the night itself all became part of their story, a witness to the forbidden love that now existed between a frontier woman and an Apache warrior, a love that could not be contained by rules, by fear, or by the harsh realities of the land they both called home. The night had fully claimed the canyon now, the sky a vast expanse of ink sprinkled with distant, indifferent stars, yet the darkness seemed to shrink around them, cocooning them in a world where only the two of them existed, a place outside the reach of the settlers' judgment. The harsh frontier and the rigid rules that governed their lives. Evelyn could feel the heat radiating from him, every inch of his presence a silent, insistent call to her own body and heart, and she found herself trembling, not from fear of the wild, not from the chill that drifted through the canyon, but from the intensity of the connection that pulsed between them. His hands, strong yet careful, traced the lines of her arms and shoulders with a reverence that made her ache in ways she had never known, a strange mingling of comfort and longing, protection and undeniable desire. She felt her pulse hammering in her throat, her chest heaving with the realization that every instinct she had relied upon to survive the harsh realities of the frontier, caution, restraint, composure, was utterly powerless against the force of what she felt for him. The canyon around them seemed alive, the rustling of the tall prairie grass and the whisper of the wind carrying a rhythm that mirrored the thundering of her heart, and even the distant cry of a coyote sounded like a chorus underscoring the intimate symphony that had begun between them. He lowered his face toward hers, and the faint brush of his lips against her forehead sent a shiver down her spine. A quiet, electric promise that both thrilled and terrified her. She wanted to tell him to stop, to resist the pull of this forbidden love, but words failed her, falling away under the weight of emotion too intense to capture with mere syllables. The air between them seemed to thrum, each movement, each heartbeat, each whispered breath intensifying the unspoken truth. That love, when it defied the rules of the world, was a force as wild, untamed, and inevitable as the land they inhabited. He drew a little closer, his face now inches from hers, and she could feel the warmth of his breath mingling with her own, the scent of pine, earth, and smoke enveloping her in a dizzying, almost intoxicating haze. Her hands, trembling, found their way to his chest, tracing the lines of muscles honed by years of survival, each touch a silent plea, a quiet surrender to the pull that had drawn them together. The canyon walls echoed with the subtle sound of their shared breaths, the faint rustle of movement, the delicate symphony of two hearts beating in unison against the unforgiving backdrop of the frontier. "Evelyn," he murmured, his voice a low, guttural sound that seemed to vibrate through her very bones, carrying with it a mixture of reverence, desire, and an almost unbearable weight of longing. She closed her eyes, letting the warmth of his body, the strength in his touch, and the raw honesty in his voice consume her senses, and for the first time in her life, she allowed herself to feel completely and unapologetically, to acknowledge a desire that had no name in the world she had been taught to inhabit. Every instinct that had warned her against him, every caution that had kept her safe, every voice that had insisted on propriety and decorum, was drowned out by the singular, consuming truth. She wanted him, not just in stolen moments or fleeting glances, but in a way that threatened to undo her very sense of self. The Apache warrior, for his part, fought against the rigid restraints he had imposed upon himself for years. The world outside demanded caution, secrecy, and vigilance. It had taught him that settlers feared him, that love across the invisible divide between their peoples was impossible, and that any intimacy could have devastating consequences. Yet in Evelyn's presence all those lessons seemed fragile, inconsequential, mere echoes against the undeniable reality of their attraction. He cupped her face with both hands now, his thumbs brushing against her cheekbones with a tenderness that contradicted the fierceness of his reputation, and she leaned into the touch instinctively, as though surrendering not just her body, but her very heart to the gravity of the moment. Their foreheads met, a delicate collision of desire and restraint, of longing and fear, and the canyon around them seemed to hold its breath, the night itself a witness to the audacity of their forbidden connection. Her eyes fluttered closed, and she felt the heat of his lips ghost across her own in the gentlest, most tantalizing of brushes, a kiss that spoke of restraint, reverence, and an aching, almost unbearable hunger for closeness. It was not the reckless passion of youthful infatuation. It was a deliberate, measured intimacy, as if every movement had been honed over centuries of survival, every touch weighed with the potential to ignite or destroy. She shivered at the sensation, feeling a heady, dizzying mix of fear and desire, understanding in that instant that there was no turning back from the path that had begun with the simple act of confession. I should not, she whispered, her voice breaking in the fragile quiet of the night, each word a tremulous admission that battled against the pull of her own desire. His hands tightened ever so slightly on either side of her face, a grounding, anchoring presence, and he replied with the slow, deliberate patience of someone who knew the power of restraint and the danger of acting too soon. "And yet," he murmured, his voice rough with emotion, "we exist in this moment, Evelyn, and in this moment nothing else matters but what is true between us." Her breath hitched at his words, the reality of their connection crashing over her in waves, leaving her lightheaded, trembling, yet exhilarated beyond measure. She could feel the battle raging within him, the tension between the duty imposed by the world outside and the uncontainable force that drew him toward her. And in that delicate balance, in the space suspended between restraint and surrender, the intensity of their love became almost unbearable, a fire smoldering dangerously close to consuming them both. They lingered like that, faces inches apart, breaths mingling, hearts pounding, in a silence that was at once deafening and intimate. A shared recognition of the forbidden nature of their feelings and the impossibility of denying them. Evelyn felt herself being pulled into the orbit of a love that defied logic, morality, and expectation, yet felt inexorably, undeniably right. Each heartbeat seemed to echo through the canyon, a drumbeat marking the beginning of a journey from fear to surrender, from restraint to the raw, uncharted wilderness of love that existed outside the boundaries of society, outside the rules of propriety, outside the reach of every fear they had been taught to obey. And in that suspended, trembling space where the darkness of night embraced them and the stars hung indifferent above, they both understood a simple, terrifying truth, that whatever awaited them beyond this moment, the judgment, the danger, the consequences, was meaningless compared to the undeniable, consuming fire that had ignited between their hearts. The first stars of night glimmered above them, pale points of light in a vast sea of indigo, and yet for Evelyn and the Apache warrior, the universe had narrowed to a single, sacred plane where only the two of them existed, suspended between fear, desire, and the undeniable truth of their hearts. Her body trembled in the aftermath of their whispered confessions, the soft electric touches, and the gentle brush of lips that had barely grazed the surface of what she longed for, yet had ignited a fire within her that could not be extinguished. She felt as though every nerve in her body had come alive, attuned to the heat radiating from his frame, the subtle rhythm of his breathing, and the magnetic pull of his gaze, which seemed to pierce through every layer of caution and propriety she had spent her entire life constructing. He cupped her face again, fingers tracing her jaw with a tenderness that belied the strength coiled within his body, and Evelyn leaned into his touch, letting herself be guided not by reason, but by a force as primal as the land they stood upon. "Evelyn," he murmured, his voice husky with emotion, carrying a depth of feeling that made her chest ache with a combination of longing and fear. "I have never known a heart as brave as yours, and yet you tremble before me, as if the world itself might consume what we share." She lifted her hands, pressing them gently to his chest, feeling the taut, lithe muscles beneath her palms, grounding herself in the tangible living reality of him. "I do tremble," she admitted softly, her voice trembling with honesty. Because what I feel is dangerous. It is forbidden. And yet I cannot stop it. I cannot stop loving you." Her confession hung in the night air, mingling with the whispering of the wind and the rustle of the prairie grass, as though the very land bore witness to the audacity of their love. He lowered his forehead to hers, closing the small distance that remained between them, and in that moment every fear, every caution, every warning the world had ever offered seemed to melt away, leaving only the raw, unfiltered truth of their hearts laid bare. The canyon itself seemed to hold its breath, the trees, rocks, and wind standing silent as though acknowledging that this was a moment beyond the ordinary, a convergence of two souls who had been fated to collide despite every obstacle. His hand slid from her face to the small of her back, drawing her close until their bodies were aligned, hearts beating in a rhythm so synchronized it felt as if they shared a single life force. Evelyn's head tilted back slightly, her lips parting in anticipation, and she felt a tremor pass through her at the nearness of him, the intensity of the heat that radiated from his body, and the undeniable force of their connection. For a moment they lingered like this, suspended between restraint and surrender, between the forbidden and the inevitable, the world outside irrelevant compared to the truth they could no longer deny. "I will not let the world dictate my heart," he whispered, his lips brushing against her temple, a soft, reverent touch that sent shivers through her very core. She closed her eyes, letting the words, the touch, the presence of him sink into every fiber of her being, feeling a liberation she had never known, a surrender not to danger but to love, to the fierce, untamed, and undeniable truth of what bound them together. And then, in the quiet intimacy of that night, with the canyon as their silent witness and the stars as distant spectators, their lips met in a kiss that was at once tentative and consuming. A collision of desire and devotion, fear and surrender, longing and fulfillment. It was a kiss that spoke of stolen moments and endless possibilities, of danger and sanctuary, of two hearts defying the impossible constraints imposed by the world around them. Evelyn felt herself melting into him, letting go of every fear, every hesitation, every thought of consequences, until only the purity of their love remained, raw and breathtaking in its intensity. His hands moved with slow, deliberate reverence, tracing her curves, memorizing the shape of her body as though committing it to memory, while hers clung to him, seeking the warmth, strength, and safety that only he could provide. The canyon's winds swirled around them, teasing strands of hair across their faces, mingling with the scent of pine, earth, and smoke, a heady, intoxicating blend that became part of the fabric of their intimacy. And yet, even in the heat of this stolen moment, both were acutely aware of the world outside, the dangers that would await should they be discovered, the harsh judgment of a society that would never condone their union. But none of that mattered now. In the depth of the night, in the intensity of their connection, in the undeniable truth of their hearts, they had found a love that was worth every risk, every consequence, every whispered warning that had ever crossed their path. Evelyn's lips parted slightly and she gasped softly against his, a sound that was lost in the canyon but echoed in the deepest recesses of their souls, carrying with it a confession of surrender, of trust, of irrevocable devotion. The Apache warrior held her tighter, his lips brushing hers again in a kiss that was at once possessive and protective, tender and consuming, a perfect reflection of the paradox that was their love. Dangerous, forbidden, and yet unbreakably true. They lingered there, wrapped in each other's arms, letting the night carry them into a fragile eternity. The stars overhead witnesses to the love that dared to exist where the world would never understand, a love that was as wild and untamed as the land itself, and yet as enduring, unyielding, and breathtakingly beautiful as the fire now blazing between them. And in that final, suspended moment, Evelyn realized with clarity and awe that she had crossed a threshold from which there was no return, that she had surrendered to a love so profound, so consuming that nothing, neither fear nor danger, nor society could ever take it from her. She whispered, her voice trembling with both awe and certainty, "I love you." And in the silence that followed, their hearts spoke louder than any words could, promising a bond that would endure beyond the constraints of the world, beyond the boundaries of the frontier, and beyond the reach of time itself.